There are shadows that follow us, silent and unseen, like a cold breath on the back of the neck. A whisper in the night, barely audible but unmistakable. It's the sensation that someone or something is always just out of sight, waiting, watching, following. These are the stories of those whose obsessions grew so powerful, they became not just men and women, but phantoms in the lives of their victims. They moved in the dark corners of our world, with only one thing on their minds: to be close, to be near. And when the hunt begins, there is no stopping it. Some stalkers are driven by a twisted love, others by unyielding hate, but all are bound by the same dangerous thread, a compulsion so strong that nothing can sever it. Their stories are not those of heroes or villains. They are the stories of the faceless, the nameless, and the relentless. In the following pages, you will come face to face with the darkness that clings to those who cannot let go. From the shadows of the night to the depths of twisted obsession, these are the tales of stalking that have haunted history. And as you listen, as you read, remember, when the hunter is silent, you can never truly tell when they are close. Brace yourself. The pursuit is about to begin. Let's talk about The Silent Watcher, Richard Lawrence's obsession with Andrew Jackson. The night was thick with tension. Richard Lawrence sat in the shadows, his breath slow and deliberate as he waited. He didn't move a muscle, his eyes locked onto the figure of President Andrew Jackson. The crowd moved in waves, bustling through the streets of Washington, D.C. But Lawrence didn't see the crowd. He saw only Jackson, his obsession, his target. And the time had come. Lawrence's story didn't begin with a moment of violence. No, it was the quietest, the slowest unraveling of a mind, the building of an obsession so deeply buried within him that even he didn't fully understand it. For years, Lawrence had wandered the streets of Washington, following Jackson from afar. He observed every detail of the president's life, memorizing his routines, his habits, the very way he carried himself. It was as if Jackson was the only thing that truly existed in Lawrence's fractured mind. By all accounts, Richard Lawrence was just another man. To others, he was invisible, lost in the crowd, but not to Andrew Jackson. No, Jackson was always on the move, always pushing forward, his eyes focused on the next battle, the next war, the next political fight. He never saw the eyes that were always on him. Lawrence knew this. He knew Jackson wasn't paying attention to him, and that only made the chase more thrilling. Then came the day, January 30th, 1835. The Capitol building was alive with activity. But for Lawrence, there was only the cold, singular focus on the man he had stalked for so long. The streets were full of people, but none of them saw the growing storm in the mind of one man. His hand shook as he slipped a gun from his coat pocket, hiding it against his side. His heartbeat quickened, his breath heavier, and yet, the closer he came to Jackson, the clearer the world became. He was no longer in the crowd. There was no noise, no distractions, just the two of them. Jackson was ahead, walking toward the Capitol steps, unaware of the death that was inching closer. Lawrence stepped forward, the gun in his hand, a single calculated motion, a quick pull of the trigger. The shot rang out, loud and sharp against the stillness of the cold air. But nothing happened. The gun misfired. Lawrence didn't flinch. There was no panic, no hesitation. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't just about the gun. This was about something deeper, something more intense than the need for success. The moment itself was what mattered, the chase, the presence, the feeling of being close. He raised the second gun, but before he could fire, Jackson turned, furious, charging toward him with the fury of a man who had survived battles and wars. The president struck Lawrence with his cane, hard. The blow knocked Lawrence back, and the crowd erupted into chaos. He fell to the ground, But even as the people rushed in to restrain him, Lawrence's eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with something else, something darker, something unquenchable. The man who had stalked the president was dragged away, but it didn't matter. He had been close. That's all that mattered. Lawrence was not interested in killing Jackson. No, he was obsessed with the proximity, being near him, seeing the fear in Jackson's eyes. That was the thrill. And so Richard Lawrence disappeared into the shadows, his obsession not with death, but with the hunt itself. Let's talk about the whispering ghost of the Black Dahlia. The city of Los Angeles at night can be suffocating. The lights from the city streets reflect off the glass and steel of the buildings, but beneath them, in the shadowed corners, there's a different kind of darkness. One that doesn't come from the absence of light, but from the presence of something wrong. Elizabeth Short, later known as the Black Dahlia, was a woman who wandered the streets of this city. Beautiful, mysterious, and full of life, she had dreams of stardom. But those dreams were destined to be eclipsed by something far more terrifying. There were no signs, no sudden warning bells. It all started slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. She began to feel it. Someone was always watching her. At first, it was just a feeling. A strange glance from a stranger on the street, a lingering stare from across the room. But then, the phone call started. Ring. Ring. The voice on the other end was always distorted. Sometimes it was a whisper, barely audible. Other times it was a low, deliberate voice that sent shivers down her spine. "I see you," the voice would say. "I'm closer than you think." Elizabeth tried to shake it off. After all, she was young, living in a city where people came and went, where faces were lost in crowds. But it didn't stop. It grew. The calls kept coming. The whispers grew more insistent. At first they were harmless, but soon the voice began to describe her every move, where she went, who she talked to, what she wore. It became personal, deeply personal. She would walk through the city, eyes darting to the side, searching the crowds. The sensation that someone was there, lurking, never left. And then, when she would return home, she would find strange marks on the door, as though someone had been there, just outside her reach, always waiting. One evening, after a particularly late night out, Elizabeth returned to her apartment. She entered the building cautiously, feeling the presence of someone behind her, though she didn't dare to look. She quickly made her way up the stairs, her heart racing. The air seemed thicker tonight, more oppressive. Something was off. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She moved faster, quicker, but as she reached the door to her apartment, she heard it, a voice, a whisper. "You can't escape me." The door creaked open slowly. The stalker was close, closer than ever before. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she rushed inside, locking the door behind her. She pressed herself against it, terrified, listening. But there was nothing, no sound, nothing but the oppressive silence. The phone rang again. Ring, ring, and then she disappeared, vanished, only to be found days later, her body dismembered and posed grotesquely, as though her stalker had turned his twisted obsession into a final act of horror. The police investigated, but no one could ever find the man who had followed her, watched her, haunted her every waking moment. His identity remains a mystery to this day, his presence still echoing in the empty streets of Los Angeles. Let's talk about the King's hidden stalker, George III's silent torment. The palace was a fortress, an imposing structure that towered over London. But it wasn't just the walls and guards that kept King George III trapped within. No, there was something far worse, a shadow that followed him, unseen by others, but never unnoticed by the king himself. It was a stalker unlike any other. Not a person, not an enemy, but a presence, a feeling, a tormentor who never showed his face. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, the king would hear noises, footsteps, whispers, faint echoes that drifted through the halls. He tried to ignore it. He thought it was nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. The stresses of ruling, of facing rebellion and personal turmoil, could surely account for the strange sounds. But soon it became clear that something far worse was at play. The footsteps followed him everywhere. They echoed in the palace halls, a constant reminder that someone or something was always behind him. He could feel the gaze even if he couldn't see it. It was in the corners of the room, the darkness beneath his bed. His rooms, once filled with the comfort of solitude, became oppressive, suffocating. The presence was relentless, creeping into his thoughts, distorting his reality. George tried to escape it. He sought solace in his work, in the business of running an empire, but it never stopped. It grew louder, closer, until one day it became unbearable. The figure was no longer just a shadow in the corners of his mind. It had become something real, something that plagued him at all hours of the day and night. The king could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. Was it truly his own mind that had fractured? Or was the stalker real? An entity that had followed him, tormenting him until he could no longer escape. Sound. A muffled thud, a gasp for breath. By the time the king's mental state had completely deteriorated, his stalker was always there. His whispers in the night, his presence at the edge of the king's vision. King George's mind fractured under the weight of his unseen tormentor. Whether it was a figment of his own mind or something far darker, he would never know. And the shadow, the stalker, never left. The king's suffering continued, a silent, eternal torment. And in the end, it wasn't just the crown that wore him down, but the unrelenting presence that stalked him in the dark. Let's talk about The Devil's Shadow, the stalker of H. Holmes. In the heart of Chicago, amidst the hustle and bustle of the 1893 World's Fair, there was a man who blended into the shadows. H. Holmes, a man with a dark, twisted mind, built his murder castle, a place where death would come silently and without warning. But even Holmes, a man who had lured so many into his deadly maze, was stalked by something far more terrifying than the police or his victims. Holmes was no stranger to the shadows. He thrived in them, manipulating and controlling those around him. He was the master of his domain, the architect of his own hell. But even a man like Holmes could not escape what haunted him. There was always someone, or something, lurking just beyond his reach, watching him, studying him. And no matter how much he built, how much he manipulated the world around him, the stalker was always closer. It began with small things. A note slipped under the door, a shadow at the edge of his vision, and then the calls. The voice on the other end was calm, calculating. It spoke in riddles, in cryptic messages that left Holmes unsettled. "I know what you're doing," the voice would say. "I'm just waiting for you to slip." Sound, the scratch of a match lighting, a faint, distant laugh. Holmes knew fear. He had caused enough of it himself. But this was different. This was a fear that was not born of blood or violence. This was a fear that was always there, pressing against the back of his mind, watching, waiting. It was a reminder that even the greatest architect of death could be undone. Holmes turned every corner, every hall, every door with trepidation. He thought he had created the perfect space, a fortress of his own making. But there, in the dark corners of his mind, there was something that refused to let go. The stalker was no longer a mere presence. It had become a reflection of Holmes's own paranoia. The voice grew louder, the shadows more oppressive. In the end, it wasn't the police who caught him. It was the stalker. The ever-present reminder that no matter how far you go, no matter how many people you trap, you can never escape yourself. And as the noose tightened around Holmes's neck, he realized that his stalker had been with him all along, following him in the darkness of his own mind. Let's talk about the haunting obsession of the Zodiac killer. It started in the late 1960s, a time when fear crept through the streets of California. The Zodiac killer, an anonymous figure, began to haunt the cities of San Francisco, Lake Berryessa, and the surrounding areas. The Zodiac was not just a killer, he was a stalker, a phantom who followed his victims for miles, watching them from a distance before striking with terrifying precision. He became the stuff of nightmares, not only for his victims, but for everyone who came into contact with his cryptic messages and disturbing letters. The first attack took place on the night of December 20th, 1968, in a remote area outside of Vallejo, California. Two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were parked on a quiet road when they were approached by a figure, a silhouette emerging from the darkness. The killer's movements were fluid, deliberate, as if he had been waiting for hours. He shot them both dead before fleeing into the night. The police were left with little evidence and no witnesses. But then, the letters began. Each letter sent to the press and local authorities was filled with detailed accounts of his crimes. He described the murders in a calm, detached tone, as though he were recounting an everyday task. The Zodiac taunted the police, daring them to catch him, sending encrypted ciphers with each letter that remained unsolved. It was as if he were enjoying the game, playing with them, teasing them with every move he made. For years, the Zodiac stalked the residents of Northern California, sending more letters, committing more murders, and always eluding capture. His eerie ability to vanish without a trace, and the chilling messages he left behind, created a sense of dread that seemed to settle over the entire region. Sound, the whisper of a pencil being drawn over a cipher. But, as with all obsessions, something changed. In 1974, a breakthrough came when the Zodiac made a critical mistake. One of his letters contained a cipher that, after years of painstaking work, was finally cracked by a teacher and his wife. The cipher revealed the killer's cryptic message: "I like killing people because it is so much fun." But still the Zodiac remained elusive. His identity was just a shadow, slipping through the fingers of those who chased him. It wasn't until 2004 that DNA evidence finally gave the authorities a break. Researchers linked the Zodiac's letters to saliva left on the stamps of his envelopes. After decades of dead ends, there was finally a lead. However, the killer's identity remains a mystery to this day, his final chilling words echoing in the cold air: "I will not give you my name." Let's talk about the obsessed lover, the stalker of Rebecca Schaeffer. In 1989, Rebecca Schaeffer was a young, rising star in Hollywood. She was known for her role in the hit television series My Sister Sam, and her future seemed to stretch endlessly before her. But lurking in the shadows was a man who had fixated on her in ways that would haunt both of them for years to come. Robert Bardo was a man who believed, deep down, that he was meant to be with Rebecca. His obsession began innocuously enough, watching her on television, reading about her in magazines. But then, like a dark seed growing in his mind, the obsession deepened. He wrote letters to her, declaring his love and admiration, but his words turned increasingly erratic and unsettling. Sound, the scrape of a pen as it digs into paper. Rebecca Schaeffer, though polite, did not respond to his letters. She continued her career, unaware that Bardo's obsession was spiraling into something far more dangerous. He began to track her every move. He found out where she lived, where she worked, and he started showing up uninvited, sitting in the audience during tapings of her show, waiting, watching her from afar. Bardo's fixation grew darker. He began to stalk her more aggressively, once even showing up at her apartment, knocking on her door, and demanding to speak with her. When Schaeffer refused to meet him, Bardo's rage intensified. On July 18, 1989, he arrived at Rebecca's apartment complex, armed with a .38 caliber revolver. He rang the doorbell. When Schaeffer answered, he shot her in the chest at point-blank range. Bardo fled the scene, but the police quickly put together the pieces. They tracked him to a nearby bus station where he was arrested shortly afterward. Bardo had been following Rebecca for months, but on that fateful day, his obsession had led him to kill. In the end, Robert Bardo was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the terror that Schaeffer felt, the suffocating dread of being watched every moment of every day, never left her. She had been a victim not just of a man's obsession, but of a relentless, invisible stalker who took everything from her. Let's talk about the Phantom of the Opera, the stalker of Christine Daaé. The world of the Paris Opera House was one of music, grandeur, and glamour. But beneath the shimmering surface of this world lay a darkness, an obsession that would forever alter the life of Christine Daaé, a beautiful and talented young opera singer. Christine had always felt the presence of someone in the shadows, someone watching her every move. But it wasn't until she became the star of the opera house that the stalking truly began. At first, she believed it to be nothing more than her imagination, the pressure of fame playing tricks on her mind. But soon, the whispers began, voices calling her name from the darkness, murmuring to her in the night. And then, the gifts. Sound, the rustle of paper, a gift being placed on a table. Perfumes, roses, and letters appeared in her dressing room, left anonymously by someone who knew too much about her. At first, the gifts were flattering, gifts from a secret admirer, Christine thought. But the tone of the letters soon shifted. They became demands, threatening her if she didn't comply with his wishes. The opera ghost, as he called himself, would not be ignored. He claimed to control the opera house, and he would do anything to have Christine perform for him alone. It was the Phantom of the Opera, a man who lived hidden in the depths of the opera house, his face disfigured and his heart consumed by obsession. He had been watching Christine for years, his love for her turning into something far more sinister. But Christine's story would not end in the shadows. As her terror grew, she found herself torn between two men, the Phantom, who stalked her from the darkness, and Raoul, the man she loved. The Phantom's obsession drove him to extreme lengths, kidnapping Christine, threatening the lives of those she loved, and threatening to destroy the opera house itself. In the end, it was Christine who held the power to end the madness. In a final confrontation with the Phantom, she kissed him, not out of love, but out of pity. And in that moment, the Phantom's obsession shattered. The man who had stalked her for so long finally released her, disappearing into the shadows of the opera house, never to be seen again. Sound. The distant toll of a bell as the Phantom retreats into the dark. Let's talk about the stalker of the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski. For years, Theodore Kaczynski, known infamously as the Unabomber, was a name whispered in hushed tones across the United States. His stalking of society wasn't one of physical pursuit, but of a terrifyingly meticulous obsession with destruction. Kaczynski's mind turned against the world he once knew. He believed that technological progress was a force of evil, and he sought to terrorize the country, one bomb at a time. Kaczynski carefully studied his targets, scientists, professors, and those he deemed responsible for the rise of technology. His bombs were deadly, silent, and unexpected, sent with no warning. He stalked his victims from afar, following their movements, studying their habits, and then striking when they least expected it. sound, the muffled thud of a bomb landing, the cold silence after. For years, Kaczynski evaded capture, his bombings growing more frequent and more deadly. His cryptic letters taunted the FBI, daring them to find him, boasting of his intellectual superiority. He crafted his bombs with an obsessive precision, a desire for recognition that grew stronger with each attack. But as the body count grew, so did the frustration of the authorities. Finally, in 1996, after the publication of a manifesto Kaczynski had written, his brother recognized his writing style. In a desperate attempt to stop the madness, his brother tipped off the FBI. Armed with this information, authorities raided Kaczynski's remote cabin in Montana, finding the vast trove of materials and bombs he had been building in secret. The Unabomber was caught, but his stalking of society, the quiet, calculated terror, continued to haunt the public long after his arrest.